Welcome back to another review of Persona 5, the game that invented anime and jazz, as we all know. This time we're here at Persona 5 Tactica, a tactical RPG. I'm not even sure what that genre type is. I thought turn-based was technical enough as it is. So we've got Persona 5 Tactica missing an L because Atlus didn't want to take an L on another Persona 5 spinoff. But it's kind of unavoidable with this one, especially with that $20 DLC ripoff for only 4 hours of extra gameplay that could have just been a bonus unlock package with the main game. But inflation is high in Japan, so they need to make the money back somehow, am I right? Tactica is basically Persona, but with a grid, so therefore it's essentially Persona 5 chess, except that you don't need to be that smart to play it because the gameplay is all about memorization. Just like chess. Except that when you mess up, you can do takebacks, and if you play correctly, you can get multiple turns in one and just obliterate the battlefield with the power of triangles. Really, this gameplay is so simplistic, all you really need to do is study Phil Jackson's triangle offense, and you'll win the championship every time. Anyway, no one asked for this game because what we all really want is Persona 6. Or, Metaphor is looking pretty good these days. And I hope that they are taking their time, pun intended, with Persona 6. But I hope they're not taking their time in the same sense that Rockstar Games is taking their time with GTA 6, because we all know the reason for that is because Rockstar and Take-Two want to keep milking GTA 5 for as long as possible. Because they're greedy cowards with no new ideas. And if GTA 6 actually turns out well, then I will retract my statement. But as of now, my faith in Rockstar is severely compromised. So I can only hope my faith in Atlus doesn't get to that point too. Now yes, technically Persona 5 Tactica is only the third mainline spin-off, if that utterance succeeds as an oxymoron. So the milking of Persona 5's udders is not necessarily as bad as Persona 4 or GTA 5 being milked for a decade long. But it's still starting to be a counterproductive issue, and I will explain my reasoning. I'm still going to discuss Persona 5 Tactica in detail, but the best way to do that is to show why the original Persona 5 is so amazing. And don't forget that Persona 5 Strikers slaps pretty hard too. I recently watched a video by Nasu in which he says that he doesn't like to replay his favorite games because he has trepidations about potentially sullying the experience from the first time. I think us gamers can all relate to this fear. In fact, this is exactly how I felt about Persona 5 Royal for the last 3 years. Because that game is one of my favorite games and stories that I've ever experienced. And I had the perfect experience playing that game with my friends back in April of 2020 for the first time. By the way, shout out to my homie for buying me Persona 5 Tactica and the DLC for me, because if I didn't get to play this game for free, my disappointment with it, or I suppose I should say my indifference to it, would be even more pronounced. However, even though I don't really want to relive Persona 5 again, because I don't want to lose those images in my mind's eye that express the particular quality of how I felt, hearing Lynn belt her heart out to sing Life Will Change, or my utter astonishment during the big plot twist for the first time, I still like to revisit the game from time to time, at least through my memories, or seeing new players enjoy the game by watching their Let's Plays. Except I have already gone back and played Persona 5 Royal all the way through New Game Plus, and I easily have several hundred hours just on Persona 5 Royal, not counting my rewatching of scenes on the tube and listening to other critical analyses of the game from other channels. You can never experience something for the first time once a second time, but who is to say that the first time is always the best time? You always get the opportunity to learn something new when you watch a movie the second, third, and nth time. And that is certainly true with a game like Persona 5 Royal, which is so massive that you couldn't possibly detect every piece of symbolism or foreshadowing the first time around because you would not know what to look for. Nor should you, because good writing involves the viewer in solving the mystery, and good writing means hiding the clues in subtext. Good viewing requires an open mind, absorbing information like a sponge, and going in blind without critical preconceptions to skew your expectations. How then is something like Persona 5 Tactica supposed to recapture our collective imaginations when the story has been told before, and all the character development is eschewed for simple-minded caricatures? The lazy writing is masked as fan service to sell and guilt-trip fans into buying a shoehorn tactics game that dilutes most of the SMT Persona-style gameplay loops that are beloved by so many. I've talked about this before, but cliche is not that which loses its meaning through repetition, because as Persona 5 shows us, all of life is repetition and routine. You don't lose the meaning of the color red just because it keeps popping up in everyday life. You don't forget that Morgana is annoying just because he already told you to go to sleep 365 times. Even though I'm actually a big Morgana fan, I'm just using him for reference. Something that is done in earnest cannot be cliche, but the actual expression. Something like Persona 5 Tactica qualifies as cliche because not only does it feature characters, themes, and plot devices that have been played out. Persona 5 Tactica actively dilutes the Persona 5 formula, which was crafted so brilliantly and so singularly in Persona 5 and the Royal, by changing the formula itself, condensing its combat systems and its character development into a shape that can only be described as square, lame by comparison. And there's another talking point that I want to address before I get into more specific analysis of Persona 5 Tactica for those that are interested in how I really feel about the game. I watched another video by Bubble Tea, who is big in the Atlus community. Shout out to Bubble Tea. But he calls out fans who posit that, by wasting time and resources on Persona spin-offs, that Persona 6 is getting delayed further into obscurity. He argues against this, saying that Atlus is big enough to have multiple teams developing multiple projects. I suppose this could be true in a technical sense. A simple Google search shows that Atlus has somewhere around 300 employees, not counting AI, I suppose, which makes Atlus a fairly big developer in terms of people. But the issue is, of course, that Atlus is divided into teams, with the big three inside of Studio Zero moving on from Persona to make games like Metaphor, and games like Catherine that were made in between the productions of Persona 4 Golden and Persona 5. They do have time to make other games, like Soul Hackers 2, which is another game that no one asked for. It seems like they have time to make everything but Persona 6. Why is this? Because when you divert time and resources, both monetary and human, you end up dividing your development team in all different directions without a clear path forward. Take a look at a team like Naughty Dog, who has a completely different issue both with its management and the talent gap, who can't seem to do anything original besides remakes and remasters of the same two games. Does that sound familiar? And by the way, aren't they using the color blue too much? I know I said that reusing an aesthetic isn't a cliche, but I might have to make an exception if they keep painting their protagonists blue. Yusuke did it best. Why anyone would think a Persona 3 remake should be favored over a new story with new characters and potentially gameplay elements that we've never seen before is beyond me. I'm sure Persona 3 Reload will be a better game than Persona 5 Tactica, but is it really artistic to remake a game that is still considered to be a classic by most of its original fans? Especially when the remake involves just implementing natural changes which Persona 5 made so pronounced? That could be a completely different video. The main idea is no, it's not stupid to suggest that a game like Persona 5 Tactica is a bit of a waste, or at least a diversion, of resources and talent that could be better spent on something more inspired, which the fans have been clamoring for. It's basic math and common sense. Even if Atlus has enough talent on hand to work on multiple projects, most of which are half-assed simultaneously, there is no way they will end up with something like Persona 5 again without all hands on deck. It would be like if a movie star has committed to doing multiple roles at the same time, and so he shows up to set late, with everyone else already in costume, already having lost their patience because the missing ingredient was swept up in a competing affair. We are unlikely to get a game as good as Persona 5 ever again in our lives. And this is based on the fact that Meguro, Soejima, and Hashino have moved on. That's still no excuse for Persona 5 to be getting milked based on algorithms and sales instead of a clear. What made Persona 5 brilliant is that it was equal parts epic narrative and character study. You have a gargantuan 100-hour plot, told across an innovative 10-act structure, with little slice-of-life moments interspersed with the action to give you a feeling of intimacy and understanding of the world and its lifelike inhabitants. Persona 5 is peak immersion in a video game because it wants you to take your time and explore. The philosophy with Persona 5 Tactica was to cut down on storytelling, perhaps to put gameplay more front and center, and this is actually a good idea in and of itself. One of my fundamental beliefs about game design, as I previously stated, is that games should be replayable, and by that I mean the core gameplay should be curated in such a way that you should be able to boot up the game and hop right into battle without further delay. This is why games like Devil May Cry are the absolute pinnacle of combat designs, because every combat situation is self-contained in a mission-like structure, inviting infinite replays. And Persona 5 Tactica uses this design to its strength, with 52 main missions replayable by chapter select, allowing you to try out different tactics and party formations without time-wasting mechanics like going through the calendar again. But the trade-off for this is that the actual Persona users get the shit end of the stick when it comes to screen time and investment in character development. You might say that the characters have already been developed, so it's only natural for the newcomers to take center stage instead of letting the player play the field with their confidants. But the problem here is that the game is titled Persona 5 Tactica, which implies that the Phantom Thieves should be more of prime importance, not just to the story but to the gameplay, which I will get to critiquing. But instead, the Phantom Thieves feel like third wheels to Arena and Toshiro's story. They come across as stale and plain caricatures of their former selves as created through the gripping origin story of Persona 5. Here they are without natural plot developments, which are replaced by shallow and contrived allegories pushed onto the player in an attempt to jerk some tears from our Persona 5 nostalgia. It does not help that Persona games are already tonally incongruous enough, bouncing back and forth between childish anime tropes and dark drama. There are almost no stakes to what takes place in Persona 5 Tactica, because it has either been obviously done before, or because the writers were content on showing their hand early, letting you know it's all taking place in a dream world where there can be no direct consequences. We saw similar methods of plot devices used in Persona 5 Strikers, but there was something about the art style, the music, and the writing of Strikers that made the game feel more like a Persona 5 extended play, despite it not sharing the closest of gameplay mechanics with true turn-based Atlus games. I think it's because everything was just on a much higher quality, for one. And for two, the inclusions of Zofia and Zenkichi felt much more integrated into the Persona 5 universe than the Phantom Thieves could possibly feel being thrown into the kingdoms of Toshiro's mind. It doesn't help that the predictable plot of killing God with the power of friendship that Yahtzee describes in his JRPG reviews was written into the game's script before a single page had been finished. The messages that were once poignant and philosophical now feel trite and preachy, with its heavy-handed writing style attempting to hammer home every minute point ad nauseum. Those of us that have Persona 5 fatigue are not simply bored by repetition. We are fearful that the worst might come true, that the characters and stories that we love so much in the masterpiece that is Persona 5 will be put into a story managed by people that don't understand what made them special in the first place, diluting their true forms through unreliable narration, like Disney has done with Star Wars and various other IPs over the years. If the story isn't told from the heart, it shouldn't be told at all. Now, this is not to say that Persona 5 Tactica's story is as bad as Forspoken or The Last of Us 2. It isn't as obnoxious or as pretentious and convoluted as those games are. There are still a few jokes here and there that manage to make me chuckle a little bit, and a few of the villain scenarios, although recycled, do have some real-world parallels, which are a cause for concern. And the sly way that Toshiro and Arena's backstories are revealed and interconnected is wholesome and interesting in and of itself, and the actors that played these characters did a job on par with the regular cast of amazing actors. But this really turned into one of those games that I ended up speedrunning through the dialogue, using that fast-forward button to its true potential. I never felt this way with Persona 5, a game so fascinating to me that my OCD compels me to see every possible dialogue option, just to see what the writers cooked up for the particular relationship scenario. In Persona 5 Tactica, I don't really care as much, because I sense the writers just phoned it in anyway. And the gameplay isn't that much better. It's your standard puzzle-solving game with gimmicks here and there, such as defeat all enemies in X amount of turns, with little enemy variety or level variety to spice things up. And for a game about using personas, this game might be the worst one in terms of utilizing the skill sets inherent in the design of the monsters. Because you can only equip one additional persona at a time, which is then essentially just a stat stick. And they just seem largely irrelevant considering that most of the enemies are weak to melee and gun attacks, which don't consume your SP. Sure, it's a nice idea to allow your party members to equip skills that they normally could not acquire, but because the combat encounters themselves are so scripted and so simplistic, I don't feel like this system is a great showcase for what the personas actually can do, for how important party compositions really can be in the mainline games. There is an interesting idea to give different movement capabilities to different party members, meaning that some levels and challenges might call for switching out a character with low movement for someone with higher movement but less damage output. There is a degree of intuition on offer in solving these puzzles, and playing the game on hard mode did present me with a bit of challenge. But there's nothing in the experience that compares to the satisfaction of Persona 5 Strikers' hack-and-slash hybrid combat, or Persona 5 Royal's epic turn-based boss battles. Everything in Tactica can be trivialized by spamming all-out attacks, and although it's cool to figure out how to set them up, once you do it, it just becomes a matter of following the script. There's definitely competent design and replay value inherent in Persona 5 Tactica, but that does not stop it from feeling a bit generic in the broader scope of the genres that are being synthesized here. The repeat boss fights toward the end are also extremely tedious, and the final fight was more of a drag than the ones at the end of Strikers and Soul Hackers 2 put together. The production values overall are still solid, with a nice twist on the Persona 5 aesthetic that we've seen be experimented with in the Persona Q games, and the rock and sound design that is unrivaled in video game history does not miss a beat here. Because you can always count on a singer as talented and as passionate as Lady Lynn, a singer so beautiful that you can hear her smile. I stole that from somewhere else, but I'm such a fan of hers that I think it applies to Lynn in particular, and so I must use it here. So Persona 5 Tactica is not a particularly bad game when viewed objectively for what it's trying to do in and of itself, but it is also not a particularly good game when judged against Atlus's standards. And because Atlus is one of the all-time great developers, when they get caught slacking in these streets, they must be held to account. This is very much my way of expressing my rage with the current state of gaming, as it moves farther away from being an artistic medium into a commercial enterprise fueled by algorithms in lieu of imagination and principle. This is not just an issue with the Persona games, which are by no means the worst offenders, but the observation must be made that Atlus is trending in the same direction as the lesser game developers around them are spiraling into creatively bankrupt territory. Like Arena, I believe in journalism, and I want people to question things. Some will say that video games aren't that deep, that the Persona games aren't that complex to begin with. Or like Kingdom Hearts, that the story is more complex than you need to hear. But it isn't that it's more complex than you need to hear, it's just more complex for the form that these spin-offs take on. It's difficult to market these games to people who have not played the other games because it would be impossible to connect with the characters on any level of the shallow characterization without having the full development with the contrast of who they are and who they were as presented through the story arcs. The Persona games are one of the most unique series of games ever made, so they should stick to their roots and stop trying to do spin-offs and collaborations that no one asked for. And this extends to remakes as well. Improvements upon formula are what sequels are for. We don't approach even making a marvel like Persona 5 if we keep attempting to reinvent the wheel like they are trying to do with Persona 3 Reload, or like they did with Resident Evil 4 Remake. Persona 5 was the culmination of the career and artistic evolutions of Katsura Hashino, Shigenori Soejima, and Shoji Meguro, among others. They might have needed to make Persona 3, Persona 4, and even Catherine before they could make Persona 5, And of course, each one of those games does something different on their own. But we don't need more Persona 5 or its characters being rehashed to us. Instead, if we wanted more Persona 5, we could always return to the source. Because in this context, it is true that nothing beats the original. Let's baton pass to Persona 6, please.